The practice of diving away to never be heard from again when the call Spitfire behind us goes out must stop once and for all. That's a bit harsh. Who wrote this? Oh, Göring. This video is sponsored by Wreck Watchers. Welcome back to Military Aviation History. I am Chris and I have another archive haul for all of you. Looking of course today at the Luftwaffe's reaction to the increasing Allied bomber rates in 1942. Specifically of course including now the beginning of the American bomber campaign. In a previous video I focused on the tactical changes in 1943. Now let's look at that previous period and then zoom out and also draw on some other data to put it all into context. Make sure to also check out the previous videos in this tactics series. A big thank you here to all the Patreons and channel members who fund my research trips to archives where I find this material for you, and of course then translate it from German into English. If you want to support this and have access to more, check out the support options in the description. I will also be releasing a new series of Inside the Cockpit soon, including the B-17, as well as a whole host of World War II warbirds, and if you're a Patreon or channel supporter, you will have early access to these episodes. To provide the context, though Germany had been bombed between 1939 and 1941, mainly by the RAF plus its Commonwealth cousins, in early to mid-1942 there was an increase in bomber activity over Germany. At night the RAF was mounting the first 1,000 bomber raids, while in August 1942 the first raids were then also flown by the US, although mainly against occupied territory, mainly into France and some of the Low Countries because of their proximity to the United Kingdom. The US didn't really fly missions into Germany proper until 1943. Of course, this also signifies the start of that split in operation. RAF continues to do their bombing mainly at night, and the Air Force, the Army Air Force, does it during the day. At the same time, the German Luftwaffe was heavily engaged on the Eastern Front and had only limited forces available in the West. Until now, Germany had no real need for daytime air defense by fighters. The RAF flew mainly at night, and in doctrinal terms, the day fighter was an offensive rather than a defensive tool for the Luftwaffe. Thus, Germany drew upon their development of night fighting equipment, radar laying AAA guns, and integrated air defense to provide a bulk of air defense both day and night. The attacks during the day started to change this. This situation caused the Luftwaffe to consider what its goals are for the immediate future. Here is how one document phrased it. When fighting enemy bomber formations, the accompanying escort screen must be ruthlessly penetrated and the attack must be carried out at the closest distance to the enemy bomber. Through unsustainable losses, the enemy bombers must be driven out of the range of German daytime fighters. We can see here that the primary aim is to get Allied bombers to stop operating at daytime over Germany by inflicting unsustainable casualties upon them. The next step would then be to inflict similar losses at night through the application of new AA guns, radar and night fighters to make any bomber attack unfeasible. If you're interested in night fighting, this is something I looked at in these videos. Now, one of the things that you often see discussed, what exact maneuvers pilots are flying during this combat when they were trying to attack bombers. And this also heavily focuses on aces and that one-on-one engagement. But if you are, like me, going through these files in the archives, you notice that at the time no one really cared that much at a force level about the exact tactics. The best pilot in the world will not win the war. The more interesting discussion is at a higher level, specifically how a force was modeled and constructed to then leverage the average pilot and their skills and their abilities within a cohesive structure. Strategy, operations, tactics, they all must be aligned to fulfill the goals, whereas then of course doctrine frames all of this and informs the practices and the discussions that accomplish the things that you are setting out to do. I will loop back towards doctrine at the end of the video. Alright, tactics. Now I must double back to an old myth. This time it is the one that Luftwaffe pilots always and without exception try to close into a short distance attack on a head-on approach and then take out the bomber. There is no primary source that substantiates the claim that this was a standard attack. Yes, it existed, but as this previous video has shown, based on primary sources, the Luftwaffe considered such attacks to be the exception rather than the norm. And that's mainly because it was very unlikely that the average pilot with their average skill set would be successful in such a high-risk attack. On a tactical level, we see that the increasing number of bombers and escorts have some effect. Specifically, the Luftwaffe aimed to not destroy individual bombers, but first destroy the cohesion of the formation, and this was to be achieved in the following manner. The tactic of the thrust attack, in German Stoßangriff, from an elevated position, which has been used almost exclusively up to now, must now finally be replaced by attacks from any directions, right up to the stubbornly executed dogfight, in German Kurvenkampf. It is important to realize here that the German word Kurvenkampf, even though it directly translates into the English turning fight, doesn't actually refer to a horizontal fight, but instead refers to a dogfight that is played out along all axes of movements. Let us consider then what the Luftwaffe's instructions were for these attacks. Long climbs and position changes result in being pushed away by the escort fighters. The bolder the attacks are flown, the sooner the enemy formation can be broken up and completely destroyed. Here we can see that the effect resulting out of an ideal attack vector was considered less significant than the effect of an attack by itself. This makes sense once we consider that pilots often did not have the luxury to place themselves at the perfect position before the attack, which would then result in a smaller number of qualitatively superior attacks on the bombers. The Luftwaffe instead wanted to increase the overall number of attacks against bombers, seeing this as the much better way forward for the average pilot. Pushing through the enemy escort fighters and destroying heavily protected enemy bombers must become a matter of principle. The leaders of this breakthrough attack are the unit leaders. If a fighter is then intercepted by an escort, the instructions are the following. The defense against an attacking escort must be carried out with cool deliberation, either by cutting the throttle and pulling up sharply, or by sliding sideways and letting the opponent overshoot. An attack must then be launched immediately and with complete determination. The practice of diving away to never be heard of again when the call "Spitfire behind us" goes out must stop once and for all. Now that we have seen how the Luftwaffe started to shift its tactics against bombers in the air, going into 1943, let us consider then the broader picture, specifically the reorganization of the Luftwaffe as well as fighter plane production. But having just talked about the Spitfire, let me just make a Californian drift here and introduce you to a cool warbird restoration project, namely X4009, flown by Australian fighter pilot Pat Hughes. Now, Hughes flew X4009, a Spitfire Mark I, during the Battle of Britain, and he was credited with 17 kills, a lot of them 109s, making him one of the leading aces of the battle. He was shot down in September 1940. His plane is now being restored, which gives you the opportunity to own a piece of it, thanks to Wreck Watches. We had them on before in the summer when their X4009 Collection was launched, and Wreck Watches of course specializes in unique and limited number timepieces that include unused original parts of restoration project, where every watch includes the original aluminium sheeting of the aircraft, and it also helps fund the restoration project. And this watch seems to have had a lot of success. I just saw that they are actually on their last dozen. So back when I first talked about them, they had a 15% discount as a pre-order bonus. That pre-order period is over, but your boy asked them to include a discount code for all of you until December 8th, 2023. So you can have that 15% discount here using MA on checkout. This is a premium product. You'll wear a piece of history, literally a Spitfire that shot down German planes. And the watch, of course, comes with free worldwide shipping as well as a 36-month warranty period. And if you want to return it for some reason, they do offer 30 days returns. Bag yourself that 15% discount using the code MA, links in the description below. Now let us consider the Luftwaffe as a whole. Did the bomber attacks in 1942 cause a significant shift? There was a lot of discussion, but on the whole, Germany was still focused on offensive operations. And the Allied bombing campaign had not yet reached an inflection point whereby it became a priority. In fact, even though the involvement of the US and the RAF's introduction of, for example, a few 1,000 bomber raids gives us a clear trajectory where this is going in hindsight, the bombing campaign was only of a slightly higher intensity than in 1941, the previous year. Nevertheless, it is still wrong to suggest that the Luftwaffe did not adapt to this dynamic within its constraints, but it mainly did so by looking at tactics and technology. We must consider the context here. By early 1942, the Luftwaffe considered the German air defense picture to be quite good. The reasons are the limited effect of the British bombing campaign, as well as the perceived effectiveness of German AA defenses. This provided confidence that with the emerging technological progress in radar and the planned expansion of night fighters, that the German homeland defense did not require a lot of daytime fighters. This was also a convenient picture, given that operationally, the Eastern Front was in drastic need for more fighters, and that doctrinally, the Luftwaffe saw itself as an offensive and not as a defensive force. The start of American bomber operations did not change this picture immediately, though initially there were some tactical problems, of course, in combating the B-17. However, American bombers did not start to fly a high number of dedicated missions against Germany until 1943. The majority of the missions in 1942 were still flying against occupied territories, for example in France. Also, tactical adaptation, some of which I already discussed in this very video, showed promise. Put together then, this prevented a clear focus on daytime fighter defense from developing. However, it is wrong to suggest that Germany just put all the eggs in the AAA basket or ignored the threat entirely. Beginning of 1942, the Luftwaffe had two Geschwaders covering the Western Front. That was an operational figures of roughly 170 operational daytime fighters. And on top of that, there was a force of roughly 190 operational night fighters in different units. By the end of 1942, about 370 operational night fighters were available for the defense of Germany, next to just over 300 daytime fighters. Again, these are operational figures, not nominal figures. Thus, the force roughly doubled in size, which is especially significant if we consider force size in total. In 1942, the Luftwaffe overall daytime fighter strength did not increase compared to 1942. We're talking about 981 versus, in fact, 916 aircraft. So in 1941, roughly 70% of daytime fighters covered the West, while in 1942, this was 32%. For night fighters, nearly all of them were focusing on homeland defense. This is even more significant if we consider production. In 1941, roughly 3,000 fighters were built, and in 1942 it was up to 4,500. However, in 1942 the losses, including write-offs, amounted to 4,000 aircraft. If we add the remaining 2,150 aircraft that had been repaired or refitted, note of course here the individual aircraft could be counted more than once, we can see the reason why the available fighter aircraft did not rise in 1942. And if we zoom out, we will also see that the fighter production does in fact go up, but the default weapon of choice for the Luftwaffe until the flip in 1944 was and remained the bomber. Despite this, the Luftwaffe, as we can see, increased the number of operational fighters in the West, and it looks like it does so at the expense of other theaters, most notably the Eastern Front. Thus we can see here that it does adapt to the threat. Though it is important to consider that not every daytime fighter on the Western Front was also used against bombers. For example, parts of this force were reserved for intrusion fighter bombing sorties against the southern coast of England. Exacerbating the problems for the Luftwaffe was, of course, the first fuel crisis in 1942. In this year, the Luftwaffe burned more fuel than it was covered by production, limiting the number of sorties and training missions that it could fly. As such, even an increase in operational numbers does not necessarily increase the force strength on any given day. And this is significant if we consider that the Luftwaffe may have reasons to prioritize fuel for offensive rather than defensive operations. However, so far, I have not found a source that clearly shows this or how the fuel was prioritized between the different units. But we may now ask, what about AAA defenses? After all, the general narrative is that Germany overemphasized the utility of flak over fighters and only made the switch to fighters way too late. As we have seen, fighter defenses in the West did in fact increase, but the same is true for flak. Over the year 1942, the German AA defenses were increased by 420 heavy gun batteries, 345 light and medium gun batteries, and 81 searchlight batteries. Each battery of heavy guns had a nominal strength of first 4 and then 6 guns. The vast majority of the heavy guns were employed by the Luftwaffenbefehlshaber Mitte for the defense of Germany, that being 838 batteries, an increase of 100 batteries over 1941. Germany would retain the use of a lot of flak guns across the war. It also had the institutional bonus that the Luftwaffe could argue that this freed up fighters for other tasks, and thus be a more effective use of their fuel. Yet the flak expansion was finite for two reasons. First, manpower, and second, the requirements for production and ammunition that took a heavy toll on Germany's resources. Depending on the statistic, it is suggested that Germany needed between 6,000 to 16,000 shots to shoot down one enemy bomber. As such, Germany aimed to improve air defense accuracy. The first step was, of course, to introduce gun-laying radar as a stopgap, and then eventually transition to early surface-to-air missiles. That, however, is a story for another time. Although, no, wait, I have a video giving an overview on that, just watch that for now. What I have laid out so far shows you that the main problem of the Luftwaffe was across the war. Of course, yes, it has a solid understanding of its limitation and the constraints it operates in, but the main problem was that it jumps from stopgap to stopgap. Or as my colleague Jens Wehner once summed it up very nicely, the Luftwaffe looks at technology and tactics to fix strategic problems. The Luftwaffe's approach to war is of course shaped by its doctrine, and that doctrine does not change significantly between, say, 1936 to 1944. And out of that comes their focus on, of course, offensive operation. They're an air force, they want to go somewhere. You must go towards the enemy and knock them out in the air, so destroy the air force, and then as part of a general combined arms offenses, assist the army. And what follows out of that is, of course, that the bomber is the primary tool delivering effect. And when bombers aren't useful, well, then you just go with the dive bomber. And when dive bombers don't cut it, by the way, of course, you can check out my book on the Stuka, but when the dive bomber doesn't work, then you use the fighter bomber. For the Luftwaffe, it's all about offensive kinetic effect. I mean, it's an air force. Yeah, of course it is. But let us flip this back to what I said in this video. When you consider the doctrine and limitations of the Luftwaffe, then it makes sense why the Luftwaffe looked towards technological progress in AAA defenses, so flak, as well as tactical adaptation of a smaller number of fighters, and considered that to be enough deterrent and forced to the Americans to also now fly at night, at which point they would have to contend with, well, the strengthened, of course, German nighttime defense network, incorporating yet another set of high-end technology in the air and on the ground. I hope you enjoyed this video and let me know what you think about it down in the comment section below. Thank you here to Andrew and Military Aviation History for their fire support on this video, and all patrons and channel members for supporting the channel. Also remember to pass by the description for the 15% discount at RAG Watches. As always, have a great day and see you in the sky.